Welcome to the motherfucking relay where we're covering today's top boxing news.
I'm not trying to take Triple G to do everything my way. I'm just trying to take what he already has and add some defense to it and raise his offense output higher. That's all. Like, those are two things. You know, yes, I want him to have a rhythm to him. I want him to have a movement because that's helpful in any scenario. But the main thing is defense and a higher offense output. Those are the main two things that's damaging for him. You know, and anybody who know how to move know it. That's why I told him, just Dimitrenko, he's going to come forward because you're so willing to go backwards. Now, if he wasn't willing to go backwards, Dimitrenko wouldn't have come. He would have had more problems coming forward. But I kept every round to do. I've been telling you all camp, you're too willing to go backwards. It's not that he hurt, not that he's scared. He's just got adapted to that, adapted to doing it. The way, the things we worked on and the things that we did in the gym, if we wouldn't have did them, he wouldn't at no point in the fight where he would have started letting his hands go. If we wouldn't have done those things. You know, so I wanted a better performance. I wanted more punches landed. I wanted more head movement. But I have to figure out my flaw first before I can tell him about his. Got to figure it out. It's something that's not crossing over. And I got to figure out, number one, what's not crossing over and why it's not crossing over. So I have a lot of homework to do. You know, I put everything on me. It's my fault. I got to cross over. I got to get over to him that he needs to do this life or death situation. Either he needs to retire or he needs to do this and do it this way.
Of all things.
Emmanuel Stewart told me one thing. He said, Jonathan, at the end of the day, your biggest thing you want is to leave with the titles. Anything else after that, you correct later. But leave with the title.
Jonathan Banks is none too pleased with Gennady Golovkin's performance, and Gennady Golovkin himself, he's none too pleased with it either. I mean, in hindsight, we can safely say that, you know, Golovkin, he didn't look his best, that this was probably the most vulnerable we've seen him in recent memory, and maybe overall. I mean, he didn't get hit this much in both the Canelo fights, and Canelo is widely regarded as a pound for pound fighter, you know, as one of the top 5 guys out there, whereas Sergey's a fighter that, you know, he operates largely under the radar, and yet Sergey was able to connect more times on Gennady Golovkin, make him look more vulnerable than anyone Golovkin has fought so far, including Canelo Alvarez. And in light of this, certain questions are being raised as to whether or not Jonathan Banks is the right fit for Gennady Golovkin, or you know, should Golovkin go somewhere else, train under someone else, because these two guys, they're not quite clicking.
Maybe.
I'd say, in all honesty, I mean, if you want my opinion, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do, I'd have to honestly say that it's too soon to tell. And I, unlike many others, am not on a witch hunt. I'm not in some hurry to assign blame to Jonathan Banks for the performance on Saturday night. I'm not, because the trainer can only do so much, and it's really up to the fighter to adhere to his trainer's instruction. Whether or not Golovkin did that or why he didn't do that, that's the mystery. But if he didn't, you can hardly blame Jonathan Banks for it. Jonathan can't run in there in the middle of the fight and start screaming in Golovkin's ear, you know, don't do it that way, do it this way. There's only so much the man can do. He can't fight the fight for him. And maybe this is a byproduct of a fighter and a trainer that aren't quite clicking. But assigning blame in this situation, it's not necessary, because in many ways it's too soon to tell. You know, Golovkin's only been with this guy for 2 fights, and the very first fight was a tune-up fight. You know, a fight where Golovkin is snapping back a small stint of inactivity. You know, him having not had a fight since the Canelo Alvarez rematch, while Canelo himself had squeezed in 2 fights
Since then.
You know, the first fight was experimental. individual, and this was the first solid guy that both Gennady Golovkin and Jonathan Banks, faced, together as a unit. This was the first guy that they fought, and Golovkin didn't look his best. But is that Jonathan Banks' fault?
Nah.
I wouldn't go that far.
Nah.
I mean, it could just be as simple as, Gennady Golovkin's getting older. What do you want? He's 37 years old. He's been doing things a certain way for a very long time. He's been with Abel Sanchez.
For a long time.
For a very long time. And as a result of that relationship, Gennady Golovkin, he's accustomed to fighting a certain fight. His muscle memory is adapted for things to work a certain way. Thus, Jonathan Banks, even in just trying to add things to his repertoire, not so much change him overall, giving Golovkin a complete overhaul, no, but trying to add one or two things that may be helpful to Golovkin. Well, at 37 years old, Golovkin's very much an old dog, at least in the sport of boxing. 37 in boxing, yeah, that's up there. And you know what they say about old dogs and new tricks. Can't teach them, It's for this reason that I don't even necessarily put the blame on Jonathan Banks. I don't think it's a situation where blame even needs to be assigned so much as it's a case of causality. By the time Jonathan Banks got Golovkin, well, Golovkin was already an accomplished fighter and more or less a finished product. Whereas now the expectation is for what? For Jonathan Banks to unfinish the product? I mean, what if these guys aren't a good fit for each other? What if they're not quite clicking? Is that someone's fault, or is it just a circumstance? I view it as a circumstance. That's what I look at it as. It's not about assigning blame. It's not about saying it's someone's fault. It's just, sometimes these things happen.
What can you really do?
Every fit may not be the right fit. Yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
Or I present another scenario. Maybe it's not even about Jonathan Banks. Maybe it's just that Golovkin's getting older and it's starting to show. I mean, you ask me, if Gennady Golovkin would have faced Sergey Derevianchenko 2 or 3 years ago, would he have had an easier time with that guy? And I dare say yes. I'd say that 2 or 3 years ago, this would have been a fight that Gennady probably wouldn't have struggled with as much. But in that way, if that's the case, then the issue isn't who Golovkin's training under so much as he's getting older and it's starting to show. It could be that way. There are a lot of ways you can look at this thing, but assigning blame, I don't think that even comes into it. I don't think that that's really necessary. Tell you what, regardless of how you want to look at this thing, that maybe Banks isn't the right fit, or maybe Golovkin's just getting older and there's not much that Banks can do about that, or maybe it's a combination of both. Regardless of how you look at these things, what we know is that Gennady Golovkin had a really hard fight on Saturday night. And because of that, this may cause Golovkin himself to reevaluate his current situation, because, he may want to go back to dominance. He may want to go back to being as dominant as he used to be, thus becoming nostalgic and turning to familiar faces in familiar places in pursuit of that dominance that he seems to have lost. I.e., don't rule out the possibility that Golovkin finds himself at the door of Abel Sanchez. That's right, that's a possibility. In the same way that Manny Pacquiao parted ways with Freddie Roach and then ended up going right back to him, well, that could happen with Gennady Golovkin. I think it's a possibility. I think it's something that can be entertained. That in pursuit of his old dominance, he may pursue his old trainer. You go in there, you have a harder fight than you've had in recent memory. I mean, you fought better guys than this, and you didn't struggle with them the way that you struggled with him. So you want to get back to being that guy. You start getting nostalgic. I mean, even Golovkin's trunks for this fight, they look exactly like the trunks that he wore for the Lemieux fight. So don't tell me that the guy might not get nostalgic. You might start thinking, I never took this much punishment under Abel Sanchez. Perhaps I should go see him. Now, whether or not you think that's a good or bad move, I don't know. I will leave such judgments up to you. But at minimum, what I'll say is that given how Golovkin performed, how he looked, how he's not happy with his performance, and neither is Jonathan Banks, there's a possibility that he decides, what, maybe I should go back to Sanchez. I'm an older fighter. I can only change so much. That guy knows me. I've trained under that guy for a very long time. He knows me a little bit more well than Jonathan does. He knows what I'm good at, he knows what I'm not good at, and he knows that I can only change but so much, especially at this age. So maybe I go back to that guy. I mean, that's a possibility. Like I said, I don't know if that's a good or bad move at this point, but I think it's something that could happen. We'll see. We'll see if it happens that way. In any event, I'm not in any hurry to assign blame to Jonathan Banks for Gennady Golovkin's performance because, well, Jonathan has only been with him for 2 fights. It's an experimental phase where you're dealing with a fighter that very much is a finished product, and that fighter's age may have as much to do with his performance as the change in trainers. You're talking about a fighter that has upwards of 345 to 350 amateur fights, close to 40 pro fights. At 37 years old, it's a safe bet that age, wear and tear, and father time might have something to do with why he got hit so much if he's never been hit that much before. You guys are ruling out the possibility that maybe he's just getting older, and that's what it is? I mean, come on, you know? I mean, one thing that's worth taking stock of is that, you know, a fighter, usually, the last thing to go on a fighter is his punch. And Gennady Golovkin very much still has his punch. This still is a guy that hits hard. You know, he dropped Sergey very early in the fight, and he opened up a cut over Sergey's eye, once again, very early in the fight. You know, so a fighter's punch, that's usually the last thing to go. But one of the main indicators that a guy's getting older, that maybe he's a bit shop-worn, isn't his punch so much as his legs. That'll tell you. You know, when a fighter's legs go, well, that's because Father Time is catching up to you, and you are struggling to outrun him. In this fight, the footwork of Sergey Derevyanchenko very much gave Gennady Golovkin a lot of problems. You know, he's a younger guy, fresher guy, very athletic, aggressive, physical guy, you know. But Sergey's footwork, yeah, the way he would attack Gennady Golovkin. You know, Golovkin will fire off a single, and, you know, maybe Sergey evades and counters, or he plays catch and shoot, follows up with a 2 or 3 punch combination. This forces Gennady Golovkin to retreat as Sergey is stringing the punches together. But you'll notice that in many times throughout the course of the fight, Sergey would pivot after letting off that combination to attack Golovkin from another angle. And this is something that Golovkin was greatly struggling with. This can be attributed to the legs, the footwork, but the legs of Derevyanchenko as opposed to the older, slower, more war-torn legs of Gennady Golovkin, who's, you know, been around the block. Guy who's been with, you know, Abel Sanchez from 2010 to what, 2000?
This year.
Yeah, 2019. Shit, he left the guy this year, you know? I mean, that shows you how new this relationship with Jonathan Banks is. That, you know, in the same year that he left Abel Sanchez is the same year he started working with Jonathan Banks. It's a new relationship. What are you expecting to happen? You're expecting miracles after only 2 fights in less than 1 year? You know, how soon? You know, what's the statute of limitations before you start seeing Golovkin turn into a different fighter? What time frame should we start expecting things to look different? That's all I'm saying. Golovkin's an old dog. It's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, and he's with a new trainer, so what the fuck are you expecting, you know? It was a close fight, and, you know, it's a funny thing about a fighter like Gennady Golovkin. Golovkin is a polarized fighter, even though he's got the personality of warm oatmeal. He's still a polarized fighter. You have a lot of people that have very strong opinions about this guy. You got guys who love him no matter what he does, no matter who he fights, and you have guys who hate him no matter what he does or who he fights. You got a polarized fighter in a close fight, you're going to get some drastically different opinions on how the fight played out. You got guys saying things like, oh, Gennady Golovkin clearly lost this thing, you know, Sergey beat him like a drum. And then you got other guys, you know, saying, no, I had it wide in favor of Gennady Golovkin. You know, you know, this is what happens when a polarized fighter has a close fight. And that's the thing, it was a close fight. If you're level-headed and you're a boxing fan, and you're just a boxing fan, you're looking at a fight, you're looking at it and assessing it, it was a close fight. Golovkin looked his age. You know, he got hit more than I've ever seen him get hit. That could be due to his age. That could be due to being in an experimental phase with his trainer. It could be one, could be some, could be none. Could just be that, you know, Sergey's that good, and you know, he came to fight, and that's what he did. He stepped up, he showed up, showed out, because he knew he was fighting a better guy than anyone who he ever fought. There's also that. I don't think too much of the showing, to be honest, because you may remember that a lot of people wrote off Manny Pacquiao after the Jeff Horn fight, that whether you think he won or you think he lost, sidebar, I think he was robbed. However, I also think that he languished and looked his age. In that fight, you know, afterwards, a lot of people felt, you know, Manny's got nothing left, that this is it, you know, it's time to hang him up. What does he do? He tunes up with Lucas Mathise, tunes up again with Adrian Broner, subsequently challenges the WBA champion Keith Thurman for his belt, undefeated guy, young guy. What's he do? He beats him. Who's to say that something similar can't happen in Gennady Golovkin's case, that, you know what, The guy's been around a long time. It was a close fight, but it doesn't mean it's all over just, because of that. Maybe some adjustments can be made, the necessary ones, and maybe he can get back to, being one of the more dominant forces in the weight, at the weight in the sport. Anything's possible. I don't know that that's what's going to happen, but I don't rule out the possibility because, it was a close fight. But Sergey, ahead of the fight, I said this. This is not a guy who's going to fall apart like a house of cards over the first hard shot that lands. This guy's tough, and he's aggressive, physical, and he can box. I said this ahead of the fight. I'm no Monday morning quarterback. Trust me on that one, okay? I knew that Sergey can be a handful before he stepped in that ring with Gennady Golovkin. I think all those aforementioned factors had their role to play, but I also think that Sergey himself had his role to play. He's a tough guy, didn't come to lay down. He wanted to leave a champion, so he fought like it, There's that. The attention now turns to, who does Golovkin fight next? Behind a performance like that, many of the names that were in the hat as potential opponent options, many of those names are now very risky options, very risky choices. Smith or Saunders, Andrade or Canelo. They're risky. Those are risky names behind a performance like that. You wonder, who will Golovkin face next? Will he fight one of them, or will he take his foot off the gas and take it easy? Because the thing is, given the amount of money that DAZN is paying Gennady Golovkin, to fight on their platform, they aren't paying this guy $14 million a fight, or whatever it is. They're not paying him that amount of money to take it easy. So who would they approve for his next opponent? What do they want to see out of him next in his very next fight? And is it something that he's equipped to deal with behind a performance like that? It's going to be very interesting to see when, where, and with who Golovkin fights next. I had a passing thought that, Golovkin's now being co-promoted by Matchroom Promotions, and that opens the door for different kinds of opportunities, different venue options. Thus, Golovkin is not limited to having to fight in America and appeal to Americans to, make some coin, turn over a profit. Eddie Hearn could orchestrate a situation that sees Gennady Golovkin fighting in a venue in the UK against a UK guy, not necessarily someone as difficult as a Smith or a Saunders, but a lighter touch. Some lighter touch where they can still turn over a profit and Golovkin will still be in a more or less winnable situation, because I don't imagine that he's going to go from one physically taxing fight into what could be yet another physically taxing fight. Not at 37 years old and not behind a performance like that. Not unless he plans on taking a substantial amount of time off, even though, I reiterate, he's 37. That really wouldn't help him either. So, I don't know. I mean, that's a passing thought that I had, that, maybe this guy's next fight isn't against any of those guys, because that performance, there's definitely some kinks that need to be ironed out. I don't know. We'll see what happens, but at minimum, what I can say is that it's too soon to assign blame to either Golovkin or Banks. It's too soon to jump to conclusions as far as what the future may hold. There are many doors that are still open in regards to what could happen next for Gennady Golovkin. Thus, the best thing to do, the most level-headed thing to do, is to reserve harsh judgments and harsh criticisms, and let's just wait and see what happens.